Hello, and welcome back to Dagish America Presents. I'm Ben Harrell, and I'm so happy to have the opportunity to talk to you about the industry that I work in. On the last episode, we talked to Doug Bell about choosing the right fumigant to use for a wide variety of different fumigations. For this episode, we've invited Blake Buckner, Director of Operations at Dagish America, to discuss some of the equipment you'll need in order to conduct a fumigation. So, please help me welcome Blake back to the podcast. Blake, how you doing today, buddy?
I'm doing just great, Ben. How about you?
I'm doing good. Hey, I wanted to give you an opportunity. You know, I always start these out because you've been a guest on every season that we've done so far. But in case somebody hasn't listened before, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I've been with Dagish since 2002, so pretty long time. Been in various roles throughout the East Coast, managing divisions and things like that. My most current role is the Director of Operations for our U.S. Offices, seven divisions across the U.S. And basically, I'm in charge of all the fumigations that take place here domestically. So I've got a pretty wide range of experience in the industry, and just really looking forward to sitting down and talking with you again.
That's great. And I really appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to sit down and help us discuss all of these important topics. It's very much appreciated.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity, Ben.
So it's always a good idea to have a really strong plan in place before you ever introduce any kind of fumigant into a structure or a commodity. And what kind of equipment you're going to need to have on hand is, of course, part of that planning, because the last thing you ever want to run into on a job site is day of application, reaching for something that isn't there because you didn't plan for it properly.
That's right. And it's always on a Saturday, and it's always late at night. So yeah, that's exactly right. What you need, you got to take with you for sure.
Yeah, so I just think I thought it'd be a good idea to kind of cover some of the bases with some of the different fumigants that we have on the market that we utilize, and just kind of a brief explanation on some of the equipment we need. Now, everybody understand this list isn't the end all be all. This is a list of some of the most important things that you're going to need, but it's not all inclusive. Every job is going to be different. You know this, Blake. Every job's different. So every job may need more equipment, different equipment, whatever the case is. But these are just kind of the basic things that I think that you're going to need in order to be able to conduct these fumigants. So hopefully I'm not speaking for you too much here.
No, not at all. I almost always give that disclaimer in these types of situations, because inevitably, somebody's going to sit down and make this list, and they'll get onto a fumigation and say, well, wait a second, I need this as well. So yeah, it's definitely not all inclusive, but it's sort of just a quick little laundry list of some of the more important things that you'll need.
All right, so let's just kind of jump in here. At first, I wanted to kind of break it out into the different types of fumigants and what kind of equipment you need for the different types of fumigants that we most commonly use. Fumigations, a lot of the equipment that you need, regardless of the type of fumigant that you're using and regardless of the type of fumigation it is, a lot of the equipment that you're going to need to have on hand is the same. But I did want to kind of differentiate. So right out of the gate, I just kind of wanted to ask you, what kind of equipment do you think that it's a good idea to have on hand when we're fumigating with phosphine?
For phosphine, I'll break it down into two categories, really. But for all phosphine, you'll want to have a low range reading device on hand just for the application, so you can monitor the breathing zones, and then combination mask and canister for a little bit of respiratory protection. You'll want to have monitoring lines and a monitoring device for efficacy. On all of the phosphine labels, they indicate that you'll need dry gloves of cotton or similar material. But if you break it down a little bit further and you go into like the loose ALP formulations and some of the MAG formulations, which would be like pellets and tablets, things like that. So let me back up just for a second. And the cool thing about phosphine is that it's super low maintenance. So you're not going to need a ton of equipment. But for things like the loose formulations, the pellets and tablets, it's kind of sounds funny, but the first thing you're going to need is a good knife to cut the packaging open and get the flasks themselves out. And then obviously you'll need the flask opener. Those lids can be pretty stubborn to open, so you'll need the flask opener. And if you're going to be using, pellets and tablets, if you're going to do a dustless application where there's no dust really allowed to be in contact with what you're fumigating, you'll need fuma sleeves or something of that nature to retain the dust. Some other little things, you'll need some rope or twine to tie the fuma sleeves off so that you can retrieve them. But if we move over to the magnesium side or the pre-pack side, the packaged products, fuma cells and fuma strips, gloves again, but it's not for the purpose that you're probably thinking. It's not all for the purpose you're probably thinking. Gloves are really important for those because they're in pails. And in those pails, if you've ever fumigated with those pails, they have a little ring around them that can be pretty sharp. So it's really for hand protection and for cut protection. And then for fuma cells, you'd want to have fuma cell bags to maintain the fuma cell. Or if you're using pre-packs for rail cars or things like that, you probably want to have fuma discs on hand to mount the pre-packs. Other than that, really, when it comes to the packaged products, you're going to need a limber back because a lot of times you're going to be bending over to apply those. And you can wear eye protection. It's not required. You're usually wearing it anyway, depending on the facility that you're on. But eye protection is something that you can wear as well. I know you're going to cover PPE and respiratory protection in some of the later episodes, so I'm sure you'll get into that a little bit deeper later. So.
Yeah. And again, all of the equipment that you're talking about is just really kind of specific to phosphine in general. I'm going to ask you about, just some of the basic equipment needed on all fumigations here in a minute, but I just kind of wanted to start out by just covering the different fumigants. So we kind of talked a little bit about phosphine. Now let's switch over and let me ask you, what kind of equipment do you think we need to have on hand when fumigating with sulfurofluoride products?
Sure. This list is, it's a little bit longer. Yeah. But again, you'll need a low range monitoring device, whether it's ClearCheck, Spectros, whatever brand you want to employ there. But you really need that, and then you need some sort of a monitor for efficacy again. For application, you'll need a full face shield for sure. But for my purposes and from my side, you have to have an SCBA on hand anyway. So we always just wear the SCBA in lieu of the face shield, and that just really eliminates having to rush to put it on, and it sort of just cuts out a step and covers two bases all in one. You'll need several wrenches to turn the cylinders and the caps. And I say several because if anybody out there, including you, Ben, has fumigated with sulfurofluoride on a pallet, you will drop one in between the in between the cylinders. So just have several wrenches around. You'll need the fittings, splitters, manifolds, things like that to connect your injection or your add lines. Monitoring lines, again, a good idea is to have a forklift handy. Honestly, it's not something that you think about right offhand, but a forklift or a pallet jack to move the cylinders around if you need to. Fans and extension cords, pigtails or surge protectors, I guess you could use. Zip ties. Zip ties are similar things to attach or affix the monitoring lines. If you're going to be doing or conducting an application that requires less than a full cylinder, you'll need a scale on hand. And maybe as important of things that you need to wear in PPE, maybe just as important as those things, you need to remember not to wear gloves or rubber boots when you're applying SF.
Oh, yeah.
So, again, this is sort of a short list of things that you'll need, but those are sort of the biggest things.
Sure. Yeah. One other thing that is really handy as well is making sure that you have fans that have a high enough capacity to move the sulfurofluoride around inside the facility during introduction, because that stuff does have when you first introduce it, it's very cold, and you can actually have a fog out if you don't move the fumigant out into the open spaces fast enough. So having good fans that you can attach the introduction lines to inside the facility is also a really critical piece of equipment. Each introduction line, in my opinion, each introduction line needs its own fan. It's based on cubic footage and application rates and some other things, but it's always a good rule of thumb to have more air movement than less inside the facility. So I always just used one fan per introduction line.
I 100% agree with that. And with whatever facility you're fumigating, and with their blessing, you will almost always find other fans and extra fans that they have. You can't depend on that, but I'm with you on as much movement, as much circulation as you can get. And honestly, it's pretty clearly outlined in the label what you need as far as cubic feet per minute and things like that. So it's a good idea to make sure that you have fans. And one thing I thought about when we were just talking, a good idea before you go out onto the job is to test those fans and extension cords, because
Oh yeah.
inevitably you're going to take 20 fans and 25 extension cords, and some of them are going to end up in the recycle pile or the dumpster at the end of the job for sure.
Yeah, yeah. Hey, one other thing that I thought about too, and this isn't during the application, but this is during the monitoring. A lot of these sulfurofluoride jobs are really large and they require multiple monitoring lines. And if you are using, like say a fumoscope for monitoring, the fumoscope has its own internal pump, and most of the equipment does, but those pumps are really slow. So if you have, say, 15, 20 monitoring lines, in order to get readings fast, it's a good idea to have a purge pump on hand, a faster pump than what the monitoring equipment has. So you can actually draw a new sample faster, then connect it to the fumoscope or whatever monitoring device you're using. Those purge pumps can really come in handy.
No doubt. I thought about two more things when you were talking too.
Yeah.
If you do that and you set up, we call it base camp. If you set up your base camp outside and you have all your monitoring lines and a purge pump, a good idea is to set up a fan blowing on you and whoever is going to be taking the readings, just to sort of clear out any of the sulfurofluoride that may be pulled out. And then this is really nitty gritty, and it's not a trade secret. It's almost always going to be hot outside. It's not a terrible idea to bring some sort of a tent or tarp or something to set up base camp under as well. So it's nitty gritty, but tips and tricks are always a good thing to throw in.
I'll tell you, you're absolutely right though. And not only does it save you at base camp from having the sun shining down on you and making you hot, actually having your equipment in the shade is going to help protect your equipment as well. Some of this equipment that we use is very, very sensitive and can overheat really easily, especially the low range equipment. So having that stuff in the full sun's never a good idea. And you're going to need it on while you're taking readings, so you're monitoring your breathing space. And so you're going to have it next to you. And if the sun's beating down on it, it can overheat pretty quickly. So having some kind of shade, whether it be a tent or some kind of overhead cover, it's pretty critical.
I couldn't agree more. It's one of the first things on the supply list, if I'm being honest with you.
Yeah. That and a cooler full of ice cold water or Gatorade
right
next to you as well.
Right.
Which I think everybody knows that. But all right. So I know that we don't do a whole lot of methyl bromide fumigations in the United States now. I mean, it's primarily used for export fumigations. But I never like to leave it out because it is done a lot for export fumigations. It's just not done a lot outside of that. So what kind of equipment do you think you have to have on hand when fumigating with methyl bromide?
Yeah, so I'm not going to repeat myself on the things that I mentioned for the sulfurofluoride fumigations, but since it's cylinderized, it's a lot of the similar things that you'll need for methyl bromide that you need for sulfurofluoride. The first is, again, I just say wear the SCBA for introduction. I think the label says 5 parts per million, but with all due respect to manufacturers, I don't feel like there's a convenient and affordable and a real-time way of monitoring for that during application. So just wear the SCBA. Loose fitting, long sleeve shirt and long pants. And again, it's mostly the same as for SF. You'll need wrenches and fittings, injection and monitoring lines, fans, extension cords, and a scale again. But one thing that really sort of differentiates SF and methyl bromide is the need for a volatilizer or a vaporizer. Depending on the temperature and the application method that you're using, you'll often need something to volatilize and vaporize the fumigant as it comes out of the cylinder before it goes into your target. So again, there's sort of there's a lot of things that are similar for all fumigations, and then in particular for SF fumigations and methyl bromide fumigations. But there's a few that will set apart the methyl bromide from the SF or even cylinderized phosphine fumigations.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned the volatilizer, because that is a very critical piece of equipment that you need when fumigating with methyl bromide in so many instances. And for anybody who's listening who doesn't know what a volatilizer does or a vaporizer does, methyl bromide has a very low boiling point. So depending on the ambient temperature that the methyl bromide is in, it can actually come out of the end of the line as a liquid if the temperature is too low. So what the volatilizer does is it actually heats up the methyl bromide in its liquid state and vaporizes it during the application to guarantee that when it comes out of the end of the line, it comes out as a gas rather than as a liquid.
I mean, I've seen it, 100 times. While you were talking, I thought of another thing. Inevitably, even if you're using a volatilizer and a vaporizer, at some point, if you're using a lot, it will not completely vaporize and come out a little liquid on the end. So it's not a terrible idea to have a drip pan there at the end of your injection line as well.
Oh, that's a good call. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, and I'll say that for SF as well. I mean, if you're following the label and all conditions are met, in theory, you won't get any liquid coming out of the end of your injection line. But if you're ever in a super sensitive area where you absolutely, don't want to mess anything up, it's not a terrible idea to put a little bit of poly down on the outside of your introduction line for any cylinderized fumigant. To be honest with you, it's not required. It's rarely needed, but if you're in a super sensitive area, it's not a terrible idea.
Yeah. All right. So this is something that I really like about these types of conversations. As we've been talking here, we've been adding things to our list, as we've been speaking. And this is exactly the kind of conversation that fumigators typically have when they're planning and preparing for fumigations. You typically think, oh, well, hey, remember we did this place last year and we need extra tape, or we need extra glue, or there's this extra door that we have to have this special kind of seal for, or hey, remember this place, we may need extra safety monitors, whatever the case is. So this conversation is very similar to the kind of conversations that fumigators have when they're planning and preparing. And so it's important to have these conversations because, like I said, as we've been talking, we've been adding things to this list, which is really common. But with that being said, I do want to go back and revisit phosphine for just a second, because I was thinking about cylinderized phosphine, which we didn't cover. And there's a couple of things in particular with cylinderized phosphine that I think that you need to have on hand that differentiate it from the other cylinderized fumigants. With the other fumigants, well, I guess you did mention manifolding with sulfurofluoride, and there are manifolds that you can have and application lines that you can have when you're using 2% phosphine. But 2% phosphine has a very, very high pressure as it's released. So you can't use the same kind of lines that you use for sulfurofluoride in order to apply the gas properly. And with 100% phosphine, because it is highly combustible in its natural state, you actually have to have special equipment to blend it with forced air to make it non-combustible during the application process. So that's a couple of things that you need when working with cylinderized phosphine that you maybe don't need with packaged phosphine, metal phosphides, or some of the other cylinderized fumigants that we've been talking about.
Yeah, and on the note of adding things to our list, really where this conversation should have started and where it always ends is the need for an FMP, for a fumigation management plan. And often when you're drafting these things and going through the process of preparing an FMP, that's when these conversations take place. All the fumigants have the requirement for an FMP, and within those sections, if you're doing it properly, when you're sitting down and preparing for the fumigation, these conversations for supplies and equipment will come up naturally throughout the course of the planning. So I just wanted to throw that one in as well before we move on.
Oh, yeah. And you're absolutely right. I mean, and it's another one of those reasons why the fumigation management plan is so critical. Not only is it a labor requirement for all the fumigants, but it's just critical in your planning stages. And the really cool thing about an FMP is if you're fumigating the same place repeatedly, you can refer back to earlier versions of a fumigation management plan as a refresher on any equipment that you do need for the jobs. You can use these things over and over again for reference to make yourself a better fumigator at these facilities when you're repeating fumigations in concurrent years.
Without question, it's the single best resource for planning. It's not even close.
Yeah, I agree. And so now I want to kind of dive into some of the more common equipment and materials that may be needed on all fumigations across the board. Every facility, every commodity, whatever the case is, they have to be sealed. They have to be typically taped and sealed. That's what we call it, taping and sealing a fumigation. What are some of the equipment needs that you think fumigators should have on hand in order to tape and seal facilities?
Before we go into the actual equipment, I'm going to wax philosophical here for a minute.
All right.
To be honest with you, from my perspective, this is not the time to be frugal. You need to use quality materials. Now, I understand cost is always an issue, and finding the best price for whatever you're using is obviously vital. But this is not the time to be cheap. This is not the time to be frugal. Make sure you're using quality materials. And fumigators are some of the most innovative people I've ever met. So there's a wide range of materials that you can use. So this list, again, is not the end all to beat all. You want to start from the inside of what you're sealing. Look for holes and light beyond the obvious. The goal is obviously to make it as gas tight as possible. So literally anything that you can use legally to do that is fair game, within reason and with the blessing of the facility. But some basic supplies are a good quality polyethylene sheeting, and not all polyethylene sheeting is created equal. So good quality polyethylene sheeting, somewhere between 2 and 10 mil, depending on your application. You'll need good quality spray glue, spray adhesive. Again, there's a wide range to pick from, but just pick the best that's the best one for your application. If you're doing an outdoor application in the hot sun and it's a 12, 13, 15-day fumigation, then you're going to need something different than if you're doing a 24-hour indoor fumigation. So just make sure you're using quality spray glue and the right one for the application. As far as tape goes, this is where it's really critical to make the right choice. You can use paper tape, you can use duct tape, and everything in between, but just be mindful of the conditions, just like with the spray glue. The thing about the tape is, when it comes to quality, think about the end of the fumigation when it comes time to take it down, when it comes time to peel the tape back. You want it to stick, but you don't want it to splinter and peel apart when you're taking it down, because you may be introducing an element of adulteration at that point. So that's where the quality and the choice comes into play with all the supplies, but specifically with tape. You also want to think, if it's going to be a place where you're going to seal it and tape and seal it and fumigate it over and over again, for efficiency's sake, you may want to think about doing some permanent seals in some places, using caulking and really anything. Again, it goes back to innovation. You would obviously need the blessing and maybe even the help of the facility that you're fumigating, but permanent seals can really, really save you some time and really money in the long run. So again, those are just sort of the basic supplies, but I stick to the mantra though, that this is not the time to be super cheap. So
right. Yeah, I agree with you. And one other thing I want to say about the tape that I think is important too is different tapes react differently in different weather conditions. So be mindful of that too. It's not a bad idea to look at the forecast and see, is there rain being called for the weekend that you're fumigating? Is there excessive heat? Is there excessive cold? Different tapes have different stickiness, so to speak, when it comes to different environments. There's been many times that I've used tape that seals wonderfully until it gets wet and then it starts falling off, or tape that seals wonderfully and then when the direct sun hits on it, it almost turns into concrete and then it's almost impossible to peel off.
Bacon tape. I call it bacon tape.
Bacon tape. I like that. Yeah. So, be mindful of that as well. Look at the weather conditions. Think, oh, well, it is supposed to rain this weekend. I may want to use a little bit of a higher adhesive tape just to make sure that my seals hold. Or, hey, it's going to be really hot and this is on the west side of the building, so it's going to catch the afternoon sun. Maybe I'll use a different tape on this side just so it's easier to peel off at the end of the job. So keeping all of that stuff in mind is a good idea as well. One other thing I wanted to mention too, when it comes to taping and sealing is, there is some elevated work that can come into play when you're taping and sealing facilities, whether it's on roofs, on top of grain bins, or just reaching the top of overhead doors that are maybe 8, 10, 12, 15 feet high, whatever the case is. So I think a lot of times when we're prepping these facilities, we have to be aware of and cognizant of elevated work. And so I wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of talk about some of the equipment that we need when we're working in the elevated areas.
So I'll start with ladders and then I'll move up a little bit from there. And again, no pun intended, but so the ladders, inspected and proper size ladders are the beginning and end really. And for what it's worth, on our YouTube channel, there's a really, really cool ladder inspection video. So if you want to dive in and check that out, that'll give you a good idea of what you're looking for when you're inspecting ladders. But if you need to go higher than that, obviously you're going to have to get some sort of a lift, man lift, bucket lift, something like that. So and when you're in And on those lifts, you're going to need fall protection by way of harnesses. So
Yep.
those also need to be inspected and regularly checked. It's a good idea whenever you're working at height that you're wearing a hard hat or a bump cap. And in fact, it's not only a good idea, I'm fairly certain it's OSHA mandated. And then once you get up to your working platform, whether it's going to be active or passive fall protection, if it's going to be active, you're going to need lifelines and anchors and things like that. So that's just really just a snapshot of what you're going to need to work from an elevated surface.
Yep. Okay. What about confined spaces? I mean, I don't think we do a whole lot of confined space entry work these days, but I know we do some. Is there any kind of specific equipment you need for confined space work?
Sure, absolutely. I think the single biggest issue when working in confined space, well, there's a couple, but single biggest issue from our purposes, working in commodities and grain bins and things like that, because that's usually where we'll be in a confined space, is engulfment, and the other is exposure. So first thing is you need to be trained in working in confined spaces and then permitted. As far as exposure goes, you definitely need a DRPMG, direct read portable gas monitor. And really, in this order, they're monitoring for the oxygen levels, combustible gases, and then toxic gases. Obviously, those are really important from a safety standpoint. It's not really equipment, but you'll need a clearly defined entry, exit, and rescue strategy for engulfment. Just that has to be nailed down, hammered out long before you ever go into the confined space or ever go into the grain bin. It is not the time to devise a rescue strategy when you need to be rescued.
Yeah.
So it's really, those are the biggest things. It comes back to fall protection, ladders, and a DRPMG if you're doing confined space.
Right. Yeah. And also, it's not necessarily a piece of equipment, but you always have to have a spotter at the entry point of a confined space area as well. Somebody that's monitoring and making sure everybody's safe in there and can respond to an emergency if needed.
Yep. No doubt.
All right. Well, I only have one more question. And this is I ask this question every season. You know this. You've been on every season so far. But I wanted to ask you, what kind of advice would you give a new fumigator about selecting the right equipment for a fumigation?
Yeah, I got to be careful here, not to be redundant, but I think all fumigators are going to hear this and be like, yeah, but it begins and ends with the label. Honestly, The equipment that you need is dictated in the label. And then we talked about the FMP. As you're going through the FMP, is creating a good solid supply list. And I'll go back to the materials. It's not the time to be frugal. Quality materials are safer and less expensive in the long run and over time. So if you use low quality tape and spray glue and poly and things like that, and you fail a fumigation, well, I'm pretty sure you lost all your gains on buying the lower quality supplies. Inspect and replace as often as necessary, from your ladders all the way down to your fittings. So everything in between, but specifically for safety equipment, you want to have that stuff inspected. As long as you stay within the label and safety guidelines, you need to use your imagination for sealing. I guess that's the philosophical advice that I'll give. As long as you stay within those parameters, you're going to have to use your imagination. I'm not suggesting it. Eventually, you're going to have to use your imagination on, number one, how to get to some places safely, and number two, how to seal them and have the seals maintained throughout the fumigation. So, those are just a few points and a few suggestions I would give. I invite you to go back to the other podcasts that I was on, and those suggestions pretty much stand for all fumigations as well. So don't be complacent and don't be cheap. Use quality materials and use your brain.
Excellent advice. I really appreciate it. All right. Well, that's all I had for you, Blake. Thank you so much for being a consistent voice on the podcast every season. It's very much appreciated.
Yeah, I would tell you to put me on the payroll, but I guess I already am. So
you already are, buddy.
All right, man. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I want to thank Blake for giving us some insight into choosing the right kind of equipment to have on hand for a wide variety of fumigations. Thinking ahead and having these items ready and available on site can save you a lot of time during the application. On the next episode of Dagish America Presents, we'll discuss some of the safety considerations you'll need to address in preparation for a fumigation. And remember, If you have a question you'd like for us to answer, feel free to email us at podcast@dagishamerica.com. You can also find us on our website at dagishamerica.com or on all of the main social media outlets. So, until next time, I'm Ben Harrell, and I hope you have a safe and terrific day.